The year was 1829, and the road that cut through the marshes did not forgive those who walked it alone. Fog pressed low against the earth, muffling footsteps, swallowing voices, and carrying with it the smell of rot and damp wood. At the edge of that road stood a tavern leaning like a tired old liar, its windows glowing faintly, its door promising warmth, while hiding something far colder inside. People said the woman who owned it knew every path through the swamps, every way a man could disappear without a sound. Her laughter drifted easily, friendly and sharp at once, and it lingered long after travelers stopped breathing it in. Those who entered her world often believed they were passing through a place of rest, a pause between destinations. By morning, some found the road again. Others became part of the land, folded into mud and shadow, their names stripped away as cleanly as their freedom. And as the night deepened, the swamps listened, patient and eternal, while one woman sharpened her hunger and waited for the next knock at her door. The tavern stood where maps grew uncertain, on a stretch of land claimed by neither state nor conscience. Its crooked frame half, swallowed by reeds and black water. Travelers reached it by accident more often than design, guided by lantern light that shimmered like a promise through the fog. To a weary eye it looked like mercy itself, a place to rest bones stiff from walking, to drink something warm, to hear another human voice after miles of nothing but insects and wind. Inside, the air carried a thick mix of smoke, sour ale, and damp wool, layered over something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. The woman who ran the place moved through it all with ease, her presence as solid as the floorboards beneath her boots. She greeted strangers with a familiarity that disarmed them, as though she had been expecting each face long before it appeared in her doorway. This tavern was not merely a stop along the road, it was a threshold. Those who crossed it stepped into a space where rules loosened and shadows thickened, where the value of a person could be weighed, judged, and exchanged without ink or witness. The woman understood this economy better than any merchant in the cities. She watched how people entered, noting their clothes, their accents, the way their eyes searched the room. Free African, Americans traveling for work, sailors between ships, laborers seeking opportunity. These were the most carefully observed. They carried hope with them, and hope made people careless. A mug of drink, a seat by the fire, a friendly question about where they were headed, and the trap quietly closed. At night, when the wind shifted and the swamp seemed to breathe, the tavern changed character. Laughter faded into murmurs, and deals were spoken in low voices that never carried beyond the walls. Men arrived who did not drink much and never stayed long, their horses kept ready, their eyes avoiding the corners of the room. Coins passed from hand to hand beneath tables, glinting briefly before vanishing again. Names were not asked for, and if they were offered, they were forgotten immediately. What mattered was strength, health, and silence. The woman presided over these exchanges with the calm authority of someone who knew the ground beneath her feet would never betray her. The borderland itself made everything easier. Jurisdiction dissolved in the marshes, and responsibility followed. If someone vanished, blame drifted away like smoke. The swamp took credit for many things: missteps, sickness, bad luck. The woman let such stories grow, feeding them just enough truth to keep suspicion vague. She spoke of travelers lost to quicksand, of drunken men who wandered off and drowned, of thieves who met other thieves in the dark. Each tale added another layer of uncertainty, another reason for people not to look too closely at what happened after midnight. Fear, she understood, worked best when it lacked a clear shape. Behind the tavern, the land dipped and twisted into narrow paths. Only she and a few trusted companions could follow. Lanterns moved there sometimes, bobbing like willow, the wisps then disappearing. Those paths led to wagons waiting beyond sight of the road, to ropes and chains hidden beneath sacks of grain, to destinations no one spoke aloud. The tavern was the front room of a larger operation, a place where lives paused before being redirected into darkness. The woman treated this process as routine, almost domestic, fitting it between cooking meals and tending fires. Violence, when it came, was swift and practical, stripped of emotion the way a butcher strips a carcass. To outsiders, the tavern's decay seemed natural, the slow sag of wood under years of weather. But those who lingered long enough sensed something else in its bones. The walls absorbed sound, secrets settling into them like damp. The floorboards creaked in patterns that felt intentional, warning the woman of movement. Even when she slept, it was as though the building itself had been trained, broken in like an animal, to serve the purpose it housed. Every object had its place. Every place its use, from the heavy door that shut too solidly to the cellar steps worn smooth by frequent descent. What made the tavern truly dangerous was not the force it concealed, but the normalcy it projected. People wanted to believe in safe harbors, in the kindness of strangers, in the idea that evil announced itself with clear signs. Here, evil wore the shape of hospitality. A smile, a shared drink, a story swapped by the fire. These were the tools that lowered defenses. The woman exploited this instinct with ruthless precision, turning the oldest traditions of shelter and welcome into weapons. Each successful night reinforced her confidence, her sense of invulnerability, and the belief that the land itself conspired with her. As months passed, the tavern's reputation grew quietly, carried by those who benefited rather than those who suffered. It became known as a useful stop, a place where questions were not asked and needs could be met discreetly. This reputation drew exactly the kind of attention the woman desired, funneling vulnerable souls toward her door under the guise of opportunity. The swamp watched it all without judgment, reeds whispering as wagons rolled away, frogs croaking as lanterns went dark. The road stretching on as if nothing had happened, as if the tavern were just another shadow along the way, and not the mouth of something endlessly hungry, waiting patiently for footsteps to approach, for hope to cross its threshold, for another life to pause at the edge of a firelight that promised rest and delivered silence. The disappearances did not arrive all at once. They seeped into the region, the way damp crept into walls, slowly, invisibly, until suddenly everything felt cold and ruined. At first, it was a single man who failed to reach his destination, a dock worker, expected in Baltimore, who never stepped onto the pier, his absence explained away by weather or drink or a simple change of plans. Then it was a pair of laborers who had left together and were never seen again, their shared vanishing briefly discussed and then set aside as coincidence. In communities where African Americans lived with the daily uncertainty of movement and safety, missing people were often absorbed into silence, their stories truncated by fear and resignation. The land was wide, the roads long, and authorities rarely cared to ask where a black traveler had gone. Rumors began as they always do, in half-finished sentences and glances exchanged when someone thought they were not being watched. A woman waiting too long for a son to return spoke of a tavern near the marshes where he had planned to rest. A sailor mentioned a place with a crooked roof and a woman who asked too many questions. These fragments drifted from church steps to dockside taverns, growing heavier with each retelling, yet never solid enough to take shape. People learned to lower their voices when the subject came up, as if the swamps themselves were listening and might take offense at being named. Fear, in this form, was diffuse and survivable, easier to carry than certainty. The roads became spaces of calculation. Travelers altered routes, chose companions where they could, or avoided stopping altogether, pushing through exhaustion rather than risk the wrong door. Free Americans who once moved with cautious optimism now carried suspicion like an extra burden, weighing every offer of help against the cost of refusing it. The absence of bodies allowed doubt to thrive. Without proof, stories remained stories, and stories could be dismissed by those with no reason to believe them. The woman at the center of the whispers benefited from this uncertainty. Her name rarely spoken aloud, her tavern described in vague terms that blurred its edges and protected it from focus. The swamp played its part in sustaining the mystery. It swallowed sound and track alike, erasing evidence with patient efficiency. A misstep could mean water closing over a head, reeds folding back into place as if nothing had disturbed them. Those who wished to deny darker explanations pointed to this natural danger, insisting that the land was the true culprit. Even among those who suspected otherwise, there was reluctance to press the matter. To accuse was to invite attention, and attention had a way of circling back on the accuser. Silence became a form of self-preservation, a choice made daily in small, rational increments. Yet the pattern continued, and patterns, once noticed, are difficult to ignore. The disappearances clustered along certain paths, followed similar timelines, shared a common starting point in conversations overheard or plans mentioned. People began to recognize the names of who vanished, not as isolated losses, but as part of a growing list that stretched across months. Each new absence sharpened the edges of the rumors, giving them weight and direction. The tavern near the border took on a different quality. In the collective imagination, no longer just a place but a possibility. A dark answer to a question no one wanted to ask directly. Families carried the burden most heavily. They searched where they could, asking questions that went unanswered, standing at the edge of the swamps and staring into green darkness that offered no reflection. Grief mixed with uncertainty, creating a restless pain that never fully settled. Without bodies to mourn, there were no funerals, no formal endings, only the endless return of hope and its slow erosion. Each day that passed without news became another kind of disappearance, a fading of expectation that mirrored the physical absence of the lost. The woman at the tavern sensed the shift in atmosphere and adjusted accordingly. She smiled more openly, offered louder hospitality, and spoke with exaggerated warmth to counter the chill creeping through the region. She understood that suspicion thrived in silence and met it with noise, with the performance of normal life continuing uninterrupted. Those who passed through and survived carried with them an impression of harmlessness that complicated the darker stories. For every rumor, there was a shrugging denial. A man who claimed he had stayed the night without incident. A traveler who remembered nothing more sinister than a strong drink and a restless sleep. Authorities, when they heard whispers at all, treated them as inconveniences. Missing Americans did not command urgency, and the lack of evidence made the matter easy to dismiss. Files were not opened, patrols not extended, questions not pursued beyond a cursory nod. This indifference settled over the region like another layer of fog, obscuring the truth and emboldening those who operated in its cover. The woman's confidence grew, fed by the knowledge that even suspicion, when unacknowledged, could be rendered harmless. Still, the rumors persisted, refusing to dissolve completely. They threaded their way through conversations, altering behavior, shaping choices, leaving an invisible mark on the landscape. The road past the tavern felt heavier underfoot, the night darker, the sounds of the swamp more watchful. People learned to recognize danger without naming it, to sense when a place held too many unanswered questions. In this way, the disappearances became a shared unease, a collective memory forming, even as the truth remained buried, waiting for the moment when silence would finally crack and the whispers would no longer be enough. The land gave itself away in small, careless gestures, the way truth often does when it has been pressed down too long. A hunter's boot sank where it should not have, the ground yielding with a softness that felt wrong even in the swamp. He cursed, pulled free, and noticed the smell first, a soreness that cut through wet earth and decaying leaves. At a glance it looked like any other disturbed patch of mud, churned by animals or water. But something pale showed through, too smooth, too deliberate. Word traveled quickly once the first bone surfaced, carried not with urgency but with a strange reluctance, as though speaking it aloud might invite the rest to rise up and answer. When more earth was moved aside, the shape became unmistakable. Human remains lay shallow and careless, hidden more by assumption than effort. The swamp had been relied upon to finish the work, to erase what human hands had left behind. But it had failed this once, exposing a secret that refused to stay buried. Those who gathered around the site stood in silence, staring down at the proof that rumors had substance. That absence had a cause. No one rushed to claim the discovery. Instead, people lingered at a distance, measuring what this knowledge might cost them. The finding unsettled the balance that had kept the region suspended between fear and denial. Bones could not be argued with, could not be explained away as wanderers choosing new lives. They forced a reckoning that whispers never could. Even so, the response was cautious, fragmented. Some insisted it was an isolated crime, the work of a transient killer, or a drunken brawl gone wrong. Others recognized the implication immediately and felt a cold certainty settle in their chests. The tavern near the border, once only a rumor's setting, now loomed larger in thought, its proximity to the grave too precise to ignore. As the news spread, the land itself seemed to change character. Paths that had felt merely lonely now felt complicit. Trees leaned closer, their shadows sharper, as if the swamp were watching to see how people would respond to what it had revealed. Those who had lost family or friends felt a grim validation, grief shifting into something harder and more dangerous. Questions that had been swallowed for months pressed upward, demanding shape and sound. The ground had spoken, and it had done so without mercy. The woman at the center of the growing unease understood the danger immediately. Shallow graves were mistakes, breaches in an unspoken contract between her and the land. She moved quickly, ordering searches of her own, measuring what else might surface if left alone. Her calm did not crack in public, but those close to her noticed a tightening, a sharper edge beneath the familiar confidence. She knew that once the earth began to accuse, it rarely stopped at a single word. Those who found the remains faced a different kind of fear. Possession of truth carried risk, and the closer one stood to it, the heavier it became. Some urged turning the discovery over to authorities, believing that exposure offered the only protection left. Others argued for silence, convinced that attention would only draw violence closer. The divide revealed how deeply the woman's influence had spread, shaping not just actions but instincts. Even now, with evidence in plain sight, uncertainty ruled. When officials finally arrived, their interest was measured and incomplete. They recorded what could not be ignored and left much untouched, constrained by jurisdictional confusion and an absence of urgency. The borderland once again blurred responsibility, turning clarity into complication. Yet the presence of authority, however brief, altered the terrain. The woman could no longer rely entirely on invisibility. Eyes lingered where they once slid away, and conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room. The shallow grave became a reference point, a place people pointed to when words failed them. It anchored fear to a location, gave dread a physical shape. Travelers avoided the area, and those who could not took longer routes, skirting the edges of the swamp, as if it might reach out and claim them next. The economy of silence began to falter, replaced by a brittle alertness that spread from household to household. At night, the swamp did not change, but people did. Every sound took on meaning, every rustle a possible confession. The woman listened as carefully as ever, weighing reactions, adjusting her movements, calculating whether the ground would keep more of her secrets or betray her again. She understood now that the land was not loyal, only patient, and patience could end without warning. The discovery of bones did not bring justice. Not yet, but it cracked the surface of a carefully maintained world. It proved that disappearance had weight, that absence left residue, that the earth remembered what people tried to forget. From that moment on, every step near the tavern, every glance toward the swamp, carried the knowledge that something buried had begun to rise, and once unearthed, it would not willingly sink back into silence. Break did not come from bravery or righteousness, but from fear turning inward, the way it always does when pressure builds too long. One of the woman's own circle began to unravel, a man who had lived close enough to the truth that it seeped into his sleep and poisoned his waking hours. He had helped move bodies, guide wagons, keep watch on roads that led nowhere good, and for years the routine had dulled his conscience into something manageable. But the shallow grave had changed the rules. The land had spoken, and now every footstep felt louder, every shadow heavier, as if the swamp itself were following him home. Paranoia settled into him slowly, disguising itself as caution. He started drinking more, listening less, asking questions that sounded casual but landed wrong. The woman noticed, of course. She always did. Her gaze lingered on him a fraction longer. Her voice cooled just enough to remind him of where power truly rested. That should have been enough. It usually was. But fear, once loosened, does not return easily to its cage. He began to imagine himself as the next mistake, the next thing the land might expose, and the thought hollowed him out. The opportunity for betrayal arrived quietly. A lawman from a neighboring county, drawn by rumors and irritated by the lack of clear answers, began asking questions where questions were rarely asked. He was not particularly driven by justice. Boredom and ambition played their parts. Still, his presence unsettled the balance. He drank at the tavern, watched faces, listened for slips in conversation. Most people gave him nothing. They had learned the cost of speech. But the man who was already breaking saw, in this attention, a narrow path to survival. Their first exchange was clumsy, indirect, a conversation that pretended to be about weather and roads, while circling something far more dangerous. The betrayer tested the ground with half-truths, gouging reaction, feeling for safety. The lawman sensed the opening and applied pressure, with practiced patience. Offering protection he could not guarantee, and consequences he could not yet enforce. Between them hung a silence thick with calculation. When the man finally spoke, it was not everything, but it was enough to matter. Information, once released, behaves differently from rumor. It carries intent, direction, weight. Names were mentioned, places hinted at, patterns sketched in rough outline. The lawman understood immediately that he was standing at the edge of something larger than he had expected. What he did not yet grasp was how dangerous that knowledge made him. The borderland had consumed better men for less. Word traveled back to the woman, not through direct warning, but through absence. The man who betrayed her began to avoid her eyes, missed meetings, lingered too long away from familiar ground. These deviations were small, but she read them fluently. She tightened her circle, changed routines, moved assets, and prepared contingencies with the efficiency of someone who had survived by anticipating collapse. Violence was considered, weighed, and postponed. Killing him too quickly might confirm suspicions she could still muddy. The lawman attempted to build momentum, sharing fragments with superiors who listened politely and committed to little. Jurisdictional confusion dulled urgency, and the victims remained conveniently marginalized. Still, the act of recording, of writing things down, created a trail that could not be entirely erased. Each report was a seed planted in hostile soil, unlikely to flourish but dangerous if left unattended. The woman sensed the shift from rumor to record, and felt something new stir beneath her confidence. Not panic, but irritation edged with concern. The betrayer's fear intensified as he realized the protection he had imagined was thin as fog. He was exposed now, balanced between forces that could both destroy him. His usefulness diminished with each piece of information given, and usefulness was the only currency that mattered. Sleep abandoned him. He jumped at sounds, flinched at sudden movements, and began to talk too much to the wrong people. Betrayal, once started, rarely stops cleanly. It spreads, infecting judgment and eroding restraint. The woman decided then that containment was no longer possible. The net had tightened enough that escape, not dominance, became the priority. Plans were adjusted to move operations, to sever connections, to abandon what could not be carried. Those loyal to her sensed the change and responded with anxious energy, following orders quickly and without questions. The tavern's warmth grew artificial, overperformed, a final act played too loudly. Outsiders noticed the strain, even if they did not understand its source. The lawman pushed harder, emboldened by the sense that something was slipping. He returned with warrants that lacked teeth, demands that relied on cooperation unlikely to be given. Each visit stirred the air, unsettled routines, and made silence harder to maintain. The woman met him with practiced composure, offering nothing but surface politeness, her eyes revealing only calculation. Both understood they were engaged in a contest neither fully controlled. The betrayal did not end the operation immediately, nor did it bring swift justice. What it did was fracture the illusion of invulnerability. Trust cracked, fear multiplied, and the careful balance that had sustained the violence began to wobble. The hunter, who had thrived in secrecy, now felt eyes on her back, felt the ground less stable beneath her feet. In turning against her, one frightened man had not exposed everything, but he had altered the shape of the hunt itself, shifting momentum just enough that the woman could no longer be certain she would always choose who vanished and who remained. And that uncertainty followed her into every shadow, every decision, every breath she took in a world that was finally beginning to close around her. The collapse did not announce itself with sirens or sermons. It arrived as a tightening, a gradual narrowing of choices until every path led back to the same reckoning. The woman felt it first in the way nights refused to stay quiet, how even familiar sounds carried an edge of accusation. The tavern, once an extension of her will, grew unpredictable. Faces lingered too long over drinks, eyes tracked her movements with new curiosity, and the borderland that had protected her began to feel like a cage whose bars were closing in. She adjusted as she always had, shedding what could be shed, hardening what remained, convinced that survival was still a matter of calculation. Pressure came from all sides at once. Lawmen returned with a persistence that no longer relied on politeness, their questions sharper, their visits less ceremonial. Word had spread beyond the swamp now, slipping into towns where records mattered and indifference met limits. The woman sensed that the old tricks would not hold forever, that the fog could no longer blur everything. She responded with motion, ordering departures under cover of darkness, sending wagons down paths she hoped were still invisible. But haste left traces, and traces invited pursuit. Those who had once benefited from her certainty began to doubt. Loyalty thinned under scrutiny, replaced by the instinct to save oneself first. A wrong glance, a delayed response, a rumor overheard in passing could turn ally into liability. The woman addressed this with the language she trusted most, reminding her circle of consequences, reinforcing fear as glue. Yet fear, when shared too widely, becomes unstable. It breeds mistakes. Someone moved too soon. Someone spoke where silence was required. The machine that had functioned through routine began to grind. Violence flared not as spectacle, but as necessity. When the betrayer attempted to disappear, she intercepted him, understanding that loose ends could unravel everything. The confrontation was swift and brutal, carried out away from witnesses. The swamp once again asked to absorb what happened, but this time the land did not cooperate as it once had. Sound traveled. Signs remained. What had once been hidden by assumption now drew attention, precisely because people were looking for it. The act meant to restore control only deepened suspicion. The law closed in unevenly, hindered by borders and reluctance, yet propelled by momentum that could not be reversed. Warrants multiplied, searches expanded, and the tavern's door opened to scrutiny rather than refuge. The woman maintained her composure, answering questions with the same practiced restraint, her voice steady even as the room around her felt foreign. She understood that dominance was no longer possible, only endurance, and even that was uncertain. Every delay felt like borrowed time. As options narrowed, desperation sharpened her decisions. She considered escape, weighing the cost of abandoning everything she had built against the risk of staying. The borderland that had once been her advantage now threatened to trap her. Roads watched, waterways monitored. Movement required permission she did not have. In this confinement, paranoia turned inward, and she began to see enemies where there were none, issuing orders that contradicted each other, sowing confusion among those who remained. Control slipped further with every attempt to reclaim it. The final confrontation did not resemble justice as people imagine it. There was no single moment of triumph, no clean resolution. Instead, it unfolded as a sequence of losses, assets seized, associates detained or scattered. The tavern's role exposed piece by piece, stripped of myth and reduced to evidence. The woman faced this with defiance rather than regret, refusing the language of remorse, clinging to the belief that survival had justified everything. Even cornered, she projected strength, daring the world to finish what it had started. The hunter became the hunted not because her nature changed, but because the environment that had nourished it turned hostile. Eyes followed her movements now with purpose, not curiosity. The swamp that had hidden her crimes offered no comfort, indifferent to loyalty or history. Each step she took felt provisional, every night a test of whether she would see morning as a free woman. The certainty that had defined her eroded into calculation without confidence. What followed was not redemption, nor even clarity, but exposure. The pattern of violence, once fragmented into rumors, was assembled into something recognizable. Names found places on paper. Absences gained context. The Borderlands' convenient ambiguity was challenged by persistence rather than moral awakening. The woman resisted this transformation with everything she had, but resistance only confirmed what had already become apparent. The illusion of invulnerability was gone. In the end, the reckoning was less about punishment than about reversal. The systems she had exploited turned against her, slow and imperfect but relentless. Fear, which she had wielded as a tool, settled on her shoulders instead. The world she had shaped through secrecy closed its doors, leaving her exposed to the same uncertainty she had once inflicted on others. The swamp watched without comment as the balance shifted, as power drained from the place that had fed on it for so long, and the road beyond the tavern stretched on, no longer leading into darkness alone, but into a future she could no longer control. What remained after her fall was not silence, but a quieter kind of noise, the sort that lingers when something terrible has passed and left its outline behind. The tavern stood emptied of purpose, its walls no longer listening for footsteps, its door opening to daylight that felt intrusive rather than welcoming. People walked past it differently now, with the knowledge that places could lie and that safety could be performed. The swamp continued its slow work, reclaiming paths, swallowing tracks, indifferent to human meaning, yet no longer able to hide what had been asked of it for so long. Families who had waited without answers learned the shape of the truth in fragments. There were no full restorations, no bodies returned to undo the damage, but there was a grim certainty where uncertainty had once lived. Names spoken again gained weight, and absences were finally acknowledged as theft rather than accident. Grief changed form, becoming something steadier, less frantic, carried forward instead of endlessly searched for. The knowledge did not heal, but it anchored loss to reality, and that mattered. The woman herself did not fade into legend as she might have hoped. Stripped of mystery, she became smaller, reduced to records, testimonies, and the dull vocabulary of consequence. The fear she had cultivated outlived her power, but it no longer belonged to her. It moved on, reshaped by memory and warning rather than control. Those who had served her scattered, some disappearing into obscurity, others caught by the same machinery they once relied on, learning too late that systems built on silence eventually consume everyone inside them. The borderland changed subtly. Roads were watched. Stops were chosen more carefully. Stories were told openly where whispers once sufficed. The land did not become safe, but it became known, and knowledge altered behavior in ways rumor never could. Travelers still passed through, but fewer did so blindly. The swamp remained vast and patient, yet its reputation shifted from accomplice to witness, a place that had endured human cruelty without absorbing responsibility for it. Time moved on, as it always does, smoothing edges without erasing them. The tavern aged into ruin, its purpose forgotten by those too young to remember why it once inspired dread. But beneath the rot and overgrowth, the ground held memory. It always does. And for those who knew where to look, the story did not end with the woman's downfall, but with the understanding that evil rarely announces itself, that it thrives in convenience and neglect, and that when it finally collapses, it leaves behind not closure, but a responsibility to remember, to watch, and to refuse the comfort of looking away again.